So when Lotus launched the full electric Elantra SUV recently, a lot of people came out of the woodworks, hands up in the air, saying this heavy SUV goes against everything that the Lotus brand stands for. Well, I'd say all those guys have just completely forgotten that alongside the Elantra, Lotus also makes this, the absolutely sublime Emira. This is a mid-engine sports car styled like a supercar. It has a 3.5 litre V6 supercharged petrol engine with 400 horsepower, a 6-speed manual gearbox, and man, is it such a beautiful car. On paper at least, you're looking at a proper true blue Lotus, but does it drive like one? It's time to find out. Let's go. The Emira is the very first new production Lotus since it was taken over by Geely back in 2017. But while the brand is no longer under Proton, it is still partly Malaysian because 49% of the company belongs to Etika Automotive, a Malaysian company. Lotus has already said that this will be the absolute last of its kind. This will be the last Lotus car with a petrol engine before they embark on a full EV future. Even as it is, they already have the Avaya hypercar, the Elantra SUV, and soon a new full electric sports sedan as well. But almost exactly like how Porsche is able to make the iconic 911s by selling more and more Cayenne SUVs, the same goes with Lotus here. Without the Elantra SUV, they would not be able to make a sports car like this. The two models just come hand in hand. Had Lotus not committed to a full EV future, this would not have existed. Now let's talk pricing. The Emira starts from 479,000 ringgit, which sounds tempting, but there is a big catch because that is the tax-free Langkawi price. With full taxes and duties included, the price swells up to over 1.2 million ringgit, which is insane. That's almost 3 times the price. That just goes to show how absurd the car taxes are in Malaysia. So at over a million ringgit, this doesn't really make a lot of sense, but at the tax-free Langkawi price, it starts to make a lot of sense, and that's precisely why this car wears a Langkawi KV plate. If you know, you know. The Emira effectively replaces the entire Lotus sports car range, including the Elise, the Exige, and the Evora. In size, this is a closest match to the largest Evora, but while that was more of a 2+2 GT or Tourer, this is more of an outright 2-seat sports car. And at the same time, it's also styled to look like a junior supercar. If you're not in the know, you would assume that this is either a Ferrari or a McLaren, and it looks fantastic. Having said that, it still looks enough like a Lotus, especially at the front end. It still has that quirky, almost bug-eyed look, and the bonnet, the side intakes take a lot of inspiration from Lotus's own Avaya hypercar. Now, this is exactly how you take a classical design into the modern era. Technically, this goes against the Porsche Cayman, but as you can clearly tell, this is a far more specialized, far more exotic machine. Even putting aside how it drives, which, spoiler alert, is absolutely fabulous, if you want to roll up to a hotel, arrive in style, make a statement, this is 2 times, 3 times better than a Porsche Cayman. In terms of visual appeal alone, this rivals a Ferrari, would cost 2 times, 3 times as much again. And while Porsche has downgraded the latest Caymans with a 4-cylinder engine, the Emira First Edition proudly wears a V6 engine. And let's listen to how it sounds. Inside, the Emira is a massive, dramatic departure from Lotus sports cars of old, and that's both in terms of design and quality. The latter is an especially important point because even the last of the Evoras, even the highest end, most luxurious versions, it had a whole lot of leather in it, but still with a lot of rough edges. It really did feel like a low volume hand-built kind of car, and not in a good way. This, however, feels like a proper car through and through. The materials, the quality, the plastics, the metal, everything feels like a legit car and not one that's built in a shed. The leather, for instance, this is fine Napa leather, and then you've got lots of Alcantara material, real aluminium, rather high quality plastics everywhere. This is top notch. But at the same time, it still manages to capture the iconic Lotus flavor for the interior. The whole dashboard is still mounted very, very low, so you get fantastic view out. You've got a solid aluminium gear knob over here, and all the major controls are just minimalist, simplified as ever. You still have this exposed manual gear linkage, even though here there is a gate that sort of covers it. Perhaps they've had complaints of, you know, some gunk getting stuck in the old exposed system, but I think it still looks great here. But yes, I'm not going to ignore the big elephant in the room, because yes, this car does share quite a fair few parts with the Proton X50. The center screen over here, all the aircon controls, both the knobs behind the steering wheel are taken directly off the Proton X50. I'm not going to deny that obvious fact. But at the same time, that's not really a big problem in most of the Emira's major markets. Like in the US, the UK, the Geely Coolray or the Proton X50, they don't exist in those markets at all. So it's only here in Malaysia that we are seeing these connections. In most other markets, they will think all the parts are bespoke to the Emira. And you know what? This isn't the first time for a sports car or even an exotic hypercar to share common parts with, you know, a civilian passenger car. The old Lotus Evora 400 famously shared the exact same wing mirrors as a Proton Persona. And going further back, the Lotus Esprit had the same taillights as a Toyota AE86. Even the Lamborghini Countach, certain versions had the same taillights taken from an Alfa Romeo Alfetta. And the Pagani Zonda, even though that is a bespoke hand-built supercar, it shared the exact same aircon controls as a Rover 45. That is essentially the Proton Persona for the UK. In a way, I think the Emira sharing certain parts with the Proton, yeah, it's not that bad of a thing. All the parts do fit the design quite well. It doesn't stick out too much. The screen, for instance, the bezel may look the same as in an X50, but the interface is completely different, completely bespoke to the Emira. I think it looks really good. Plus, it has full wireless Apple CarPlay as well. It's also linked to a premium KEF sound system, which is just about good enough to match the really loud supercharger whine inside the cabin. The aircon controls, they work well enough, they look minimalist enough to fit the whole cabin, and the finishing does feel remarkably better than the one in the Proton. And if you look closely, the guy in the picture down there is actually wearing a race helmet. That is a really nice, cute detail. There are only two things that I don't like about this interior. Number one is this flip up red switch for the stop start button. I think in theory it is a nice feature to have. I mean, certain Lamborghinis had it. My favorite supercar of all time, the Mercedes McLaren SLR, had the same thing as well, but over here it just feels a little bit tacky, and you do have to flip up this red thing and then press the thing. It's a bit of a mess, I think. But the worst thing about the car, the most egregious thing about this entire car as a whole, is the key fob. First thing, it doesn't feel expensive enough, it doesn't feel special enough, it feels rather plasticky. But on the side, it actually says "for the drivers" in a really tacky, cheap way. Surely they can do a much better job with a key than this. This is something you'd feel every day. Yeah, why? In terms of practicality, the Emira is actually not that bad on paper. Lotus says this has a 359 litre load bay, until you find out that that is actually a combined figure for the rear boot and this small sliver of a space behind the seats. And the boot itself, because it's positioned right next to the engine, it gets really hot in there. If you carry your groceries in there, by the time you get home, they will be well cooked. But on the other hand, Lotus has also made this interior far more accessible, far more practical than before. For instance, you no longer feel like your body is being twisted as you drive along like in the Evora. The pedal box is far less offset, it's also a bit more spacious down there, so you do feel like you're almost driving a normal car, not a really compromising sports car. And then there's also the big issue of getting in and out of the car. The Lotus sports cars of old, the Elise, the Exige, even the Evora had this big massive problem of having really thick and wide side sills. That is just part of the design of the aluminium bonded structure underneath the car. So in those cars, to get in and out, you almost have to be a contortionist, and even then you'd look absolutely ridiculous doing so. In this new Emira, the side sills are still quite wide, but is nowhere near as bad as before. Even for a person, well, my size, I can still get in and out of it without too much issue. It's nowhere near as easy as like a Porsche Cayman that is practically a normal car, but compared to the old Lotuses, this is far better. Massive improvement here. In a lot of ways, the Lotus Emira feels like such a transitional car for the brand. To start with, it has a proper 3.5 litre V6 engine up front, paired to a traditional manual transmission here. Further on, they will also have a 2 litre 4-cylinder turbocharged engine from AMG, and that smaller engine is only going to be paired to an 8-speed dual clutch transmission. So yeah, it's moving from 3 pedals to 2 pedals very soon, and beyond that it is going to transition into a full electric sports car as well. So if you're a bit of a purist, if you want Lotus as a Lotus should be, this is the one to get, and you better be quick about it too. Now, this being the Lotus Emira first edition, it gets the proper engine, the 3.5 litre petrol Toyota V6, and as is usual in a Lotus, it is supercharged, as you can hear. Most of what you hear is the supercharger whine and the intake as well, not so much the engine and the exhaust, but I'm not complaining really. Here, the Emira makes 400 horsepower and 420 Newton meters of torque. And if you choose the automatic version, you get slightly more torque at 430, and it's also slightly quicker as well from 0 to 100. The manual is claimed to do 4.3 seconds. The automatic, as usual, is slightly quicker at just 4.2 seconds. And unfortunately, this isn't quite the most powerful version of this engine. The last runs of the Evora with the same engine had up to 420, 430 horsepower, but here we are stuck with the standard 400. But that is only on paper, because out on the road, as you drive along, that hardly matters. This feels glorious. It's an absolute gem of an engine. It may have very humble roots from like a Toyota Camry or something, but here in the Lotus, it is muscular, it sounds great, it is, yeah, it's a proper engine, mate. As you can hear, it is very, very loud, but most of it is coming from the supercharger or the intake. It adds on a very raw, very visceral feel to everything. It doesn't quite feel, as sterile as a Porsche with its 2 litre, 2.5 litre 4-cylinder engine. This is even louder, even more raw than Porsche's straight 6 engine. It sounds fantastic. In terms of feel, the big V6 feels like an even bigger engine, and that's mostly to do with the supercharger. Now, with a normal turbocharged engine, usually you put a turbocharger, it feels like, a small engine with a big turbocharger on it. It doesn't have a very linear engine response. It goes from a bit of a turbo lag, and then poof, off you go with a big boot full of torque. This one, it feels far more linear, like a big massive 4-5 litre engine. and it's the better for it because you get far more usable performance. Now, a lot of sports cars these days, they have become way too fast, way too quick to be driven on normal roads. You just put your foot down for 5 seconds and suddenly you're pushing almost 200 kilometers per hour. With this car, you can actually enjoy, a fair few seconds of full throttle and still be within, 120, 130, whatever. It's not scarily super insane speeds just yet. This is far more drivable out on the roads compared to one of those ridiculously overpowered sports cars that we have these days. So in a sense, it's actually a good thing that this doesn't have more power than before. 400 is just nice. It doesn't feel slow. It doesn't feel too fast either. It is a really good middle ground for the Emira. And especially with the full manual transmission, you have full absolute control of the amount of power that you put on. Like say you're on top gear now, you put your throttle down, the car moves away, but it's not snapping your head back. But if you so wish, you can just, and off you go. It is a fantastic experience through and through. And then you've got a lot of proper Lotus bits as well. This includes the manual transmission. It's got hydraulic power steering, no EPS, electronic power steering nonsense here. And even the suspension, you do have an option between touring or comfort mode, as well as a harder, more hardcore sport system. But that decision has to be made when you order the car at the factory. Once the car is out, that's all you get. You are stuck with your decision. There is no fancy adaptive suspension trickery here. Everything is designed to be as simple, as essential, as basic as it gets, as per the original ethos of Lotus. This particular car is fitted with the softer touring suspension with more road bias Goodyear tires as well, and especially for Malaysian roads, that is definitely the way to go. Right now, the ride comfort is great. It's fantastic for a sports car like this. It actually rides the bumps really, really well, far better than most other sports cars in the same segment. Most sports cars these days tend to be overly aggressive, overly stiffly sprung. So when you drive it on the road, on normal, Malaysian bad roads with a lot of potholes, bumps everywhere, jumps here and there, this feels far more supple, far more livable. And it's a massive, massive change compared to the skateboard, stiff riding Lotuses from before. It's not without fault, obviously. The 6-speed manual gearbox, as nice as it is to use, it does feel a little bit heavy, a little bit notchy. So yeah, it doesn't quite feel as slick as a Porsche manual or even a Honda Civic Type R manual gearbox. It doesn't have that, mechanical clickety-clack feel of those cars. You feel like you have to force the knob into the gear a little bit, especially selecting first can be a little bit tricky before you get used to the feel over here. It's the same with the clutch as well. It is relatively hard, relatively heavy, and if you're stuck in a traffic jam in a car like this, yeah, in half an hour you'd swear off driving a manual completely, I think. But that's all gonna change as soon as you hit an open road again. Such a bliss. Such a good car to drive. The blend of everything just works perfectly together. The big and loud and brash engine, this really sharp and pointy steering with a lot of feel to it because it is hydraulic, and the self-managed manual transmission, it really does put you right in the center of attention in driving this car. You feel like you are part of the process. You are the one handling the car, not the car driving you. In a lot of modern sports cars these days, you sort of feel like the car is doing most of the work and you're just in there for a ride along. Here, you are the hero, you are the MVP. there's a lot of things that people are saying about this car that is not very positive. Number one, it is basically just a new Evora because it has a similar chassis, similar platform, same engine as well. But you know what, I really think this is an all-new model because the Evora, even as good as it was, it had a lot of flaws. It was rather too uncompromising to drive despite being supposedly a more comfort-oriented GT cruiser. It still felt too cramped in the middle. It was still too hardcore to drive. There's no way you can drive that car day in and day out. With this though, you can. It's not quite as easy to live with as, you know, a Porsche Cayman that practically drives like a normal car, just that you sit slightly lower. This, to drive, to sit in, is actually closer in feel to the Cayman rather than the Evora, and that is definitely a good thing. With this car, you don't really feel like you're sitting on the floor like in a Formula One, like in a go-kart, like you did in the older Lotus sports cars. With this, you sit rather, well, relatively high, but that also gives you a really good view out, and Lotus has absolutely nailed the driving position and the view out in this car. You sit rather high, the dashboard is set really low, even the windows, they sort of cut lower towards the front of the car to have a better view out. The wing mirrors, they point out really far forward. They've got a nice, really thin neck over there for you can see through. The pillars are not too big, not too thick. You can still see the front corners, the front haunches over the wheels. This is a really easy sports car to drive, far less intimidating than older Lotus cars from before. Now, back to the engine. I think it has two very distinct, very different characters. If you put it in a high gear, run between 1000 to say 4000 RPMs, it feels like a really gutsy engine, but not an insanely powerful one. So if you use slightly higher gears through corners and whatnot, it just feels like, say, a 200, 300 horsepower car. But if you really push the car, if you really use the lower gears, push the engine up to like beyond 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 RPM, and it is an absolute rocket. This can keep up with the Porsche Caymans and whatnot, because this, despite being a modern car with all your safety equipment and everything, is still a relatively light car. Yes, it is a fair bit heavier than the Evora that it technically replaces by almost 200 kilograms, but to drive you don't really feel all that extra weight. The suspension, especially in this touring setup, it does have a little bit of a softy, roly-poly feel to it, but I think that actually adds to the handling characteristics of this car. You sort of feel like you are flowing through the corners. There's that extra level of fluidity as you drive along. Lotus ride and handling, that magic is still there. They are still absolute masters at making their cars feel special to drive. And crucially, that's both whether you're driving it at full bore on the track or maybe at, 5, 6 tenths on public roads. You get to enjoy the car either way, however way you drive it. Driving this car, you do get a bit of nostalgia about everything, from having to roll your own gears, having a proper mechanical feel from the gear knob, from the clutch pedal, to being able to see an actuator right in your rear view mirror controlling air into the supercharger. It just feels so mechanical, so old school, so visceral. Yeah, I think driving this car on the weekends for fun and driving an electric vehicle on a daily, on a weekdays to work, that is an absolute dream of a 2-car garage. If I can only have 2 cars in my garage for the rest of my life, I'd go with an EV as my everyday drive, that is for sure. For my track toy, for my weekend toy, I would heavily consider one of this. Big engine, manual, I wouldn't have it any other way. So that's my quick review of the Lotus Emira. In short, I think it looks great and it drives even better. It still has that raw and visceral driving feel that we all know and love from classic traditional Lotus cars, but here it's also served with big spoonfuls of class and modernity. Compared to Lotuses of old, this is just far more comfortable, far easier to live with every day. Without a doubt, this is the most complete Lotus sports car ever. But at the same time, there is no denying that the Porsche Cayman is the better car to live with overall. It is even more comfortable still, far easier to drive. It asks for even less compromises from you as a driver. But that's just the thing. If you're looking for a car to drive every single day, by all means, get the Porsche. But if you're looking for a weekend toy, I'd go with the Lotus Emira every single time. And just knowing that this is the last of its kind, the last Lotus with a proper petrol engine, a big V6 and a manual gearbox at that, you just know that this is going to be a high value collectible in the long run. Yes, it is a big shame that we'll no longer have a car like this on the roads very soon. But in this case, I'm so glad that Lotus has made a car like this today, right now. As a swan song, as a last hurrah, what a car this is.